Numbers 35, verse 9. And the Lord said to Moses, say to the people of Israel, Numbers 35, verse 9. And the Lord said to Moses, say to the people of Israel, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall select cities to be cities of refuge for you, that the manslayer who kills any person without intent may flee there. The cities shall be for you a refuge from the avenger, that the manslayer may not die until he stands before the congregation for judgment. And the cities which you give shall be your 6 cities of refuge. You shall give 3 cities beyond the Jordan, and 3 cities in the land of Canaan, to be cities of refuge. These 6 cities shall be for refuge for the people of Israel, and for the stranger, and for the sojourner among them, that anyone who kills any person without intent may flee there. And in verse 30, if anyone kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death on the evidence of witnesses, but no person shall be put to death on the testimony of one witness. Moreover, you shall accept no ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall be put to death. And you shall accept no ransom for him who has fled to his city of refuge, that he may return to dwell in the land before the death of the high priest. You shall not thus pollute the land in which you live, for blood pollutes the land, and no expiation can be made for the land for the blood that is shed in it, except by the blood of him who shed it. You shall not defile the land in which you live, in the midst of which I dwell, for I, the Lord, dwell in the midst of the people of Israel. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
When you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall select cities to be cities of refuge for you, that the manslayer who kills any person without intent may flee there. The cities shall be for you a refuge from the avenger, that the manslayer may not die until he stands before the congregation for judgment. And the cities which you give shall be your 6 cities of refuge. You shall give 3 cities beyond the Jordan, and 3 cities in the land of Canaan, to be cities of refuge. These 6 cities shall be for refuge for the people of Israel, and for the stranger, and for the sojourner among them, that anyone who kills any person without intent may flee there. And in verse 30, if anyone kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death on the evidence of witnesses, but no person shall be put to death on the testimony of one witness. Moreover, you shall accept no ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall be put to death. And you shall accept no ransom for him who has fled to his city of refuge, that he may return to dwell in the land before the death of the high priest. You shall not thus pollute the land in which you live, for blood pollutes the land, and no expiation can be made for the land for the blood that is shed in it, except by the blood of him who shed it. You shall not defile the land in which you live, in the midst of which I dwell, for I, the Lord, dwell in the midst of the people of Israel. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Recently, my son made an impassioned and actually remarkably well-argued plea that school should last no more than 3 hours a day. He actually had thought this through. He had it. I can see his point. He thought, and including recess, right? Including recess. 3 hours a day. And hey, look, he's in 2nd grade. He knows how to read. He knows how to write. He can add, subtract, and multiply. Division's a little hazy, but what more do you need, right? Honestly, what did you learn after 2nd grade? Not much. At least that's the way he sees it. And I can see his point. And when I was in 2nd grade, I would have agreed with him completely. But as I do not set the educational requirements for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, boy's out of luck. Anders Ericsson, who's a Swedish scientist, he did some work about 20 years ago, and he developed a rule of thumb. And his rule of thumb was what he called the 10,000-hour rule. I don't know if you ever heard this. Basically, the idea is that it takes 10,000 hours of experience and practice to become an expert in something. Whatever it is, whether you're talking about music or whether you're talking about a particular trade, whether you're talking about sports, whatever. 10,000 hours, and basically that works out to like 20 hours a week for 10 years. And his argument was that that's about what is required for most people to become an expert. Some people can do it a lot more quickly. There are prodigies who can learn, for example, piano in a much quicker pace than everyone else. But for most people, 10,000 hours. Which is to say that if my son wants to be a productive member of society, he's going to have to go to school a little longer than he wants to. 10,000 hours was not enough for the Israelites. And partly that's because what they were trying to learn, what God was trying to teach them, was actually much more difficult than piano, or much more difficult than tennis, or much more difficult than welding. Because often when we take those things up, we already have like a natural aptitude for them. We already have some basic talents. What God was trying to teach Israel was obedience. And obedience wasn't just something they didn't have an aptitude for, that we don't have an aptitude for. Obedience is something that's completely contrary to our nature. And so it takes a long time. And in Israel's case, 40 years in the wilderness. Those decades, they were, yes, on the one hand, punishment, right? Discipline. But they were just as much a kind of necessary apprenticeship. They were just as importantly training. And it took them every minute of it. Training when God gave them his law. Training when he pointed them toward the salvation to come in Jesus Christ. Training when he established the pattern of true worship. Training when he otherwise instructed them in what it was to be a people set apart from the world for him. To be the chosen people of God. And to be the chosen people of God, they were going to look different from the world. They were going to do things differently than the rest of the world. There were going to be visible differences. And one of those differences, one of the most profound ones, was supposed to be in the value that they placed on human life. To say that the pagan world treated life cheaply is a massive understatement. I mean, you all have watched gladiator movies, right? This is the quiet. You guys are dead today. You all right? All right. You're allowed to talk. I mean, not to me. You're not allowed to talk to each other. But you've all watched. This is a world. This ancient pagan world is a world in which human beings butchered each other in arenas for the entertainment of crowds. This is a world in which prisoners were tortured and murdered for amusement, right? This is a world in which people, this happened in Egypt, in ancient Egypt, this is a world in which people were literally hunted for sport. This is a world in which unwanted babies were left out in the open. The word was, they were exposed. And that meant that they were just left on a hillside to die. And the thought was, hey, if the gods want them to live, the gods will let them live. And of course, the gods didn't intervene because the gods weren't there. Not to sound alarmist, but in that respect, honestly, the old pagan world was an awful lot like the new pagan world. It's not very different. You find that there's nothing new under the sun. That's what Solomon said, right? You find that what goes around comes around. And this is a world in which we live, this new pagan world in which, once again, life is, if not quite as cheap as it was in the old pagan world, at least it can be bought, and it can be sold, and it can be taken. The law that's laid down here in the 35th chapters of Numbers is intended to set a different standard for Israel. The basic principle, it's established in verses 16 to 21, then again in verse 30. And the basic principle is this, that murder is punishable by death. That's the basic principle, right? That those who shed blood, their blood will be required of them. It's simple enough. But we're not talking about some random blood vengeance here. We're not talking about a feud. This is tempered, and it's tempered with things like these cities of refuge that were established so that if you accidentally killed somebody, you could flee to the cities of refuge and you could get a fair trial. You could get a hearing before the congregation, before the people, a jury of your peers. It's tempered with the requirement that you can't be put to death on the testimony of one witness. It's got to be at least two, and so forth and so on. And the whole point of all of this is to make a very simple assertion, and the very simple assertion here that sets Israel apart from all the other nations on the earth is that Israel is to recognize that human life comes from God. Human life bears the likeness and the image of God, and consequently, human life is infinitely valuable in the eyes of God. And not to be bought or sold or taken casually. Begins here, verse 9. We read about these 6 sanctuary cities, 3 in Canaan and 3 on the other side of the Jordan. Why? Well, because some of the Israelites were going to stay on the east side of the Jordan River. So it's set up there. And these sanctuary cities, they're established not just for Israel, they're established for sojourners, foreigners, Gentiles. Anybody can use them. And that makes an important point here, that is that it's not just Israelite life that is valuable to God. It's all human life. It's not one nation, one tribe. It's all people. And they could flee to these cities, and they could stay there until there was a trial. Now, when you read this, you got to keep in mind a couple of things about this old pagan world. One of them is that this is a world without police and without jails, and consequently, the only way most people got justice was if they took it themselves. Furthermore, this is an honor-based, clannish society, and what large parts of the world are today. You know this, right? What this boils down to, I mean, we have a couple of folks who have served in the Middle East. You've seen this up close. What this boils down to is if you kill my brother, I am honor-bound to kill you. And if I can't kill you, the next best thing I can do is to kill your wife and to kill your children and to kill your brothers and your sisters. And if I do that, you turn around and you come after me. Or your brother comes after me and you hunt me down. And if you can't kill me, you kill my wife and my kids and my brothers and my sisters. And then another of my siblings goes after you, and it descends in this spiral of violent vendetta. And if you can't imagine that world, watch The Godfather. That's exactly what it is. You don't go to the cops. You take vengeance yourself to preserve the honor of your family, right? That's the idea. You don't want people to think you're weak. That's what this world was. Now, what the Lord does here is he establishes, in these sanctuary cities, he establishes like a cooling off zone where you can go in case of an accidental homicide. You say, wait a minute, what do you mean accidental? I mean, if 2 men bump into each other, one falls down and cracks his head on a stone and dies. If a woman is working on her roof in this part of the world, houses have flat roofs, still to this day. People do a lot of work on their roofs. If you're working on your roof, you fall over, you bump something off the edge of your roof, it falls down, hits somebody on the head, they die. That kind of thing. You can flee to the city of refuge, and you could stay there unharmed until you got a trial. They were, and this is almost, incidentally, this is almost unique in the ancient world. But there was, if you're found to be guilty of premeditated murder, if you kill somebody not accidentally, but out of malice aforethought, is the legal phrase, the punishment is clear here. If there's two or more witnesses. Verse 19, the murderer shall be put to death. The avenger of blood shall himself put the murderer to death. Now you can read this and you can say, wow, this is violent. And isn't this inconsistent? I mean, human life is sacred, and yet God commands the death of murderers? Isn't that, is there not an inconsistency here? This is the same argument, incidentally, that winds up being leveled against folks who would oppose abortion, right? The idea is that if you oppose abortion, you have to also oppose capital punishment. You want to be consistent. And, if you want to oppose murder, you have to oppose holy war. All of these things. It's a bogus argument. Now, I say that as a guy who personally, if you ask my own personal opinion is that the death sentence as practiced in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in the 21st century is a desperately flawed and unfair thing and really should probably, practically speaking, just not be done. And I say that because it's obviously dramatically affected by things like race and wealth. And you don't believe it's affected by wealth? 2 words, 3 words, 4 words, whatever, letters. OJ. You don't believe that the administration of justice is affected by how much money you have? OJ. And the simple fact is that innocent people have been put to death. And that's horrifying. But that said, what God lays down here, that's a practical consideration. What God lays down here, though, is not inconsistent. What God lays down here is a simple principle, and that principle is that life is not ours to do with as we please, that life is God's. And that life is so precious that not only do you not murder, but life is so precious that the punishment for murder is death. Life is so precious to God, it is God's to do with as he sees fit, that he can simultaneously punish the murderer and yet order his people to invade Canaan. He can do with human life as he sees fit, and obviously we see in our own experience that he does. He does. You might also notice verse 31 that there's a no bribery clause here. We mentioned money. Verse 31 here says, you shall accept no ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall be put to death. In other words, it does not matter who the murderer is. You don't get off because you are wealthy. At least you're not supposed to. You're not supposed to get off because you are the king, even though David thinks he does. Life is life, and human beings have intrinsic, inalienable rights simply by virtue of being human. There's one other odd provision here, real quickly, and that is that the person who accidentally kills another and flees to these cities of refuge has to stay there until the death of the high priest, verse 28. And at that point, that accidental killer can go home and be safe. Now, there are what does this all mean to us? 2 things. The first thing this means to us is it's a reminder to us, a sobering reminder that human life is not disposable or dispensable. On the one hand, this is a reminder that human life cannot be thrown away or taken away because it becomes either inconvenient, a burden to others. Have you ever read about the Nazi T4 program? T4 was the code that the Nazis used to designate the program by which those who were disabled, mentally and physically, who were deemed to be an expense to the state, were put to death because they weren't, quote-unquote, productive members of society. Hundreds of thousands of people were put to death because they were disabled. It was the T4 program because they were inconvenient. Life cannot be taken because we're angry. This is as in cases of murder here, right? That's not a justification. I was mad. Life cannot be taken because we judge that life maybe not to be up to par, not up to the standard that we would set. Example. Do you know, I hope you do, because it's important. Do you know that as of the last 2 years in Belgium, not only is euthanasia legal, but involuntary euthanasia is legal, including cases of children. What that means is, in the case of a child with a severe disability or a person with a severe illness, a panel of doctors can be convened and can decide that that person will not enjoy a sufficient quality of life to continue, and regardless of the wishes of that person's family, we're not talking about withholding care. That's different. What they're doing is actively putting people to death. Human beings have profound value simply by virtue of being human, made in the likeness and the image of God, and bearing, incidentally, not coincidentally, the image of Jesus Christ. I am convinced that one of the principal witnesses of the Church of Christ in the 21st century is going to be a simple affirmation that human beings cannot be commodified. And what I mean by commodified is human beings cannot be bought, cannot be sold, cannot be farmed, cannot be used as tools. Whether we're talking about sex trafficking, right, treating human beings as a commodity in that way, whether we're talking about cloning people for parts. Don't buy the euphemism, folks. What is being proposed in several circles is nothing less than farming people for spare parts. Whether we're talking about all kinds of human trafficking, eugenics, whatever. This is going to be one of the witnesses of the church in the 21st century, simply to stand up and say, human beings are made in the image and likeness of God and are infinitely precious. That we cannot buy or sell or farm or treat them as property. And the church, I expect that the church will stand alone in that witness, because I don't see where else it would come from. That's the one hand. On the other hand here, these laws about murder and about the cities of refuge, they also point us deeper, and they point us, as so much does in Numbers here, and we've seen that all the way through, they point us to Jesus. They point us to Jesus. Paterius, who was a theologian in the 6th century, I'll just read to you what he wrote about this odd detail of the high priest's death. He said, "What does it mean that a homicide returns for absolution after the death of the high priest, except that the human race, which brought death upon itself by sinning, receives absolution for its guilt after the death of the true high priest, namely our Redeemer?" We, as sinners, we're in limbo, so to speak, until our high priest gave himself up for us, that we might be absolved of our guilt, and that we might return to our true home, to the true place of citizenship that we bear, that we might return to God. Even the dire warning in verse 33 points to Jesus. Verse 33 says, "You shall not pollute the land in which you live, for blood pollutes the land, and no," either expiation or atonement, depending on how you translate that, "can be made for the land for the blood that is shed in it, except by the blood of the one who shed it." Now that's a little convoluted, but think of it this way. Sin begets blood. That's been true since the very beginning. Chapter 3 of Genesis, sin. Chapter 4, murder. That's right. It follows on. You look in the life of David. One chapter, David is committing adultery. The next chapter, David is murdering his mistress's husband. Sin begets blood, just generally speaking. And that blood pollutes the land. That blood is an offense in the eyes of God. He said so to Cain. He said, "Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." And the warning here is that there is no atonement. There's no way to scrub that guilt except by the blood of the ones who shed it. Now, that should be terrifying to us, except that we have a Redeemer who is himself fully man, who is one of us, and at the same time fully God, who is able to, his blood is able to stand for ours. He is able to stand in our place. He's able to die in our place, to bear our punishment, so that we can be cleansed of that guilt, and that we can be reconciled to the Father. Human life, it's not a cheap thing, and it can't be treated cheaply. God doesn't treat it cheaply. He treats it so powerfully valuably that Jesus Christ laid down his life to save ours. Let's try to treat others with the same dignity. Amen.